Data visualization is also storytelling with data. In this video, we're going to be looking at a couple of examples of particularly effective ways of communicating data by making plots that speak for themselves. The first one I will point out is a philosophical story, which is the idea that sometimes when you're making a plot, you actually want to make it less accurate because that's what matters here. As an example, here we see a version of the London Underground map from 1908. Now, those of you who are familiar with the London Underground might see that this is an accurate portrayal of the metropolitan area of London. There's the river, here's all the neighborhoods, and those where are all the stops in terms of where they actually are in physical reality. However, this was a really confusing map for a couple of different reasons. One, it was impossible to see the middle of town where there's lots of stops because they were all crammed up together and the font was really small. In fact, all of the space out here was taken up by all of these far-flung stations, and there's a ton of white space that's not useful in terms of conveying to people where the stops actually are and how do you get from one place to another. So this type of map became obsolete with this following map that was made by Harry Beck in 1931. This is the type of underground map that has been popularly adopted by every other subway map in the entire world because it actually focused on what was important in terms of an underground map, what the stations were and what's the relationship between how do you get from one to the other. And it actually does a really piss poor job of telling you where the stations actually are in physical reality. So by ignoring information and making false information about where these places actually are, it's actually becoming more useful because it more concisely conveyed the information that an underground writer actually wanted to know, which is how do you get from one station to another? Where do I have to exchange stations? This type of underground map is a really interesting way of saying concisely what is important and ignoring things or even misconstruing things that are not important for that particular audience, for the story that is being told at that particular moment. The second thing I wanted to say is that usually, just like in the London Underground map, sometimes you make a data visualization and the best thing that you can do is to stand back and not explain it and let the plot speak for itself. We're going to look at this plot here. And I think the story very much speaks for itself. I'm going to explain it a little bit, but hopefully you've already seen it and you can kind of see what's going on here. What we're looking at here is the relative frequency of the search term diet in Google sorted by the days of the year, starting from January 1st over there, all the way back here onto the next January 1st. So what you'll see, as this plot does very well conveying in a self-explanatory way, is that there's a huge spike in the incidence of people searching for the word diet on January 1st. This then dips down a couple of times during the year. It dips down during Valentine's Day. In the United States, it dips down on July 3rd, which is right before Independence Day, and July 4th. And then for the second half of the year, it goes down precipitously until it hits its all-time low on New Year's Eve and on Christmas Eve and on Christmas Day, going back up again on January 1st. The story that's being told here is super duper obvious, and it does not need to be explained. So this is a really great data visualization because the data speaks for itself, just like in the London Underground map. Another thing that I wanted to emphasize is this mantra that message trumps beauty. So we've seen, you've probably seen lots of really pretty graphics before, lots of people making really beautiful infographics, and I'm a huge fan of those. But one of my favorite data visualizations is actually this following one, which came out in the New York Times in looking at press attention of autism versus the scientific evidence of actual risk of autism. Now, if you just look at it, maybe with your glasses off, so you can't read the words, this actually, it's not a particularly pretty graph. But it tells the story in a very clear way. So I'm just going to take out a couple of rows of this data graphic here. We're going to look into it and talk about exactly why this is such a clear graphic. So what we're doing here is looking on the left-hand side, the frequency of those words, factors, are occurring in newspapers. On the right-hand side, the actual risk in terms of how those factors are known to cause autism. Factors studied, including that identical twin is autistic, and so this is mentioned. This is mentioned often in newspapers, but not nearly as often as the word vaccination is mentioned in newspapers. Whereas there's absolutely no scientific study that shows that there is a risk of vaccination for autism. And so by this dichotomy of things on the left and things on the right and the number of factors in the middle, it tells a really compelling story, even though the infographic doesn't have any gimmicky graphics and doesn't have any cool colors or whatever. It just has a really clear way of conveying the message by itself. So storytelling with data, I mean, I can talk about this all day long, but in terms of making a short video, I just wanted to emphasize 2 key points in terms of storytelling with data that I hope to have given you some examples of here. The first one is that the plot should make the message pop. You decide in advance what the message is. And that message had better be the most visually salient thing when you look at the plot. It should be self-explanatory. It shouldn't need a caption. It shouldn't need somebody standing there explaining it. It should be the thing that pops off the page, the first thing, that is a takeaway message from the plot that you're making, whatever the message is that you are trying to convey with that graphic, with that plot. Now, sometimes a data set can support multiple stories, and so you actually make separate plots that tell different stories using the same data set. But the same general strategy applies. The message should be the thing that pops off the page, and it should not be something that takes a lot of digging around for you to be able to convey. The second thing is that message trumps beauty. You do not have to make the most glossy infographic ever to make your message the thing that is popping off the page. So at all times, my recommendation is to stick to the 3 C's: clear, concise, and compact. Something that is the message should be clear, should not be impossible to misunderstand. It should be concise. If it could be said with fewer words, do. If it could convey with fewer lines, do. And it should be compact. If it doesn't have to have a bunch of white space, make it smaller. If it could be done with 2 colors instead of 5, make it smaller. Something that is the minimal version that you can actually use to convey your message should be the thing that is the first and the foremost in terms of storytelling with data. It doesn't need to be the most beautiful thing in the world. It just has to actually convey the message and tell the story you're trying to tell with your data set.